So whether you're watching it with us live and in person, then that's amazing. Oftentimes I will respond directly to the comments or put the comments up. So it's always good to have you check in or ask questions or make comments as we're going along live, but also come back and reread them throughout the day and the week. And I know that several of you even watch like a month or 6 weeks later. So whenever you're paying attention, whenever you are in the Word, whether it's with us or not with us, you're always going to get something out of it. And I always super appreciate whenever you're spending time with us. Today's Bible study is brought to you thanks to the generosity of all of the donors at ChristTable.today. And if you've not checked out the website, if you've not gone there and signed up for our email list, then I'd encourage you to do that. And if you are a donor, here in the next day or two, I'm going to start sending out copies of this Bible study, a whole 50 Bible study. This is a really cool book, I have to admit. Whenever these came in the mail from the printer at the end of last week, I looked at it and said, man, I'm super excited about this. Now, what this is 50 days to make you more spiritually whole. And what I've done is I've gone through the entire Bible and I've picked out 50 Bible passages that have been the most transformational spiritually in my life and have built a daily Bible study around those. It's going to begin on Easter. And like I say regularly, if you know anything about me, these are not your normal Bible passages for spiritual growth. So they're going to be a few in here that you recognize, but also a lot of things in here that you look at and you say, okay, what's he thinking there? And hopefully by the end of it, you will have some insight into your spiritual life and how to be more whole spiritually. And anyone who donates at ChristTable.today will be getting one of those in the mail next week. So looking forward to sharing that with you. Today's Bible passage is quite interesting. And, when I first started looking at it, I thought, where are we going to go with this? So if you've got your Bible, feel free. We're in Mark 13, verses 1 through 20. And this is a difficult passage. And part of the difficulty, I think, of the passage today in the Bible study is that so many people, I don't want to say have taken it necessarily out of context. Whenever we come to passages like this, it's kind of hard to know what the meaning is. And so it may well be that the people who have taught on this in relation to end times are correct, but it's not a foregone conclusion, I think, that some of those interpretations of this passage are on point. And anytime we come to what's called apocalyptic literature, which is writings that deal with things in the future, especially things that deal in the future in a way that seems to weave in suffering and harm and struggle, the word apocalyptic literature, it becomes very difficult for us because we're so far removed from the situation in which it was written in and spoken in. But the good news is as I continue to kind of dive into this passage, there are some things that I think that we can pull out of this and understand from the time, and also some things that I think that we can safely pull out of the passage for us today without taking too many logical leaps. And so why don't we just go ahead and jump right in and start looking at it. Mark chapter 13. Now remember, this is essentially the final week. We are in Holy Week here in the scripture. The triumphal entry has happened, Palm Sunday, as it were, and Jesus is in the final hours of teaching and time with his disciples and with his followers before the Last Supper and the crucifixion. And so kind of keeping that in mind helps us understand a little bit how to best interpret and view these passages by knowing the context. So as Jesus was leaving the temple that day and having been in Jerusalem for Passover week, they would have spent a significant amount of time at the temple complex every day, at least, and probably multiple times a day. They would have made their way to the temple complex. One of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the walls." This was a very impressive building. It was built by Herod. It was intended to be awe-inspiring. The closest thing that I think that today I might liken it to is some of the building projects in Dubai. It was just meant to be spectacular, to be ostentatious, to be expensive, to draw attention to the builder. Herod, perhaps his greatest legacy, and even at the time, was his building projects. And so this is what he did and who he was. And the temple was intended to be the crown jewel of what he built. And it was a magnificent building by all accounts, not just sacred, but also secular accounts. And it was the pride of the Jewish people, and certainly was the pride, clearly, of the disciples as well. So they draw attention to it. Jesus, what an amazing place of worship this is. And Jesus replies in verse 2, yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. It must have been hard for them to imagine that because of the size and the magnitude of these buildings. And I brought along some artist renderings of Herod's temple. You can see in this one that it is just an incredible experience. It was built with the finest stone, the finest craftsmanship, took decades and decades in order to complete. Much of the temple was gold plated. It was massive. In this picture, you can see the height of it, multiple stories tall. Imagine how they did that before the advent of mechanical tools in order to stack stones on top of each other. But it was a incredible structure. This rendering in 3D shows the scale of it. You can see right there in the center of the temple complex, those little white dots are people. And so you get a sense of the scale of this facility. It was enormous, and you could see it from everywhere in Jerusalem. It was the crown jewel. And Jesus is saying that this will be destroyed and not one stone will be left standing on top of another. They could not imagine the day where that would be true. The stones that were used to build this temple were larger than Greyhound buses. How would it be that somebody would be able to come in and not only completely destroy this complex, but destroy it in such a way that not two stones would be left standing on top of each other where they had originally sat? Now, if you've ever been to Israel, you're able to see that Jesus' words came true. In 70 AD, just a couple of decades after Jesus spoke these words, Israel was invaded. The temple complex was completely obliterated, and most of the stones that were in this complex still remain there, but they were just thrown over the sides of the temple. Now, this is a wall that has been rebuilt, but you can see in the rubble at the bottom that much of the stones that were used in the original temple were just simply thrown over the sides and were left there. And so all around the sides of the Temple Mount, you can see the stones that once were a part of that great worship facility, the temple, are now just lying in rubble, not standing on top of each other, and things have been rebuilt up on top. The Dome of the Rock, obviously, there is a Muslim holy place there at the top of the facility, but nothing from the original structure was left standing. And the Western Wall, which you may have heard of, the Wailing Wall, is the only part of the original structure that still stands, and just a very small segment of the original foundation walls that held up all of the embankments around the facility still stand. And it is not just a moving experience spiritually, but also is a confirmation that what Jesus said would come true. And it did, not too long after he spoke those words. But it was not within the disciples' ability really to comprehend how that could be the case. And Jesus goes on and continues to speak things that disciples just were not able to understand. Later that day, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across from the Valley of the Temple, which is an incredible view of the entire temple complex. If you've ever been to Israel from the Mount of Olives, you can see the size and the scale and the magnificence of what it must have been. And in those days, whenever Jesus is speaking these words, it was all still standing. And so Peter, James, John, and Andrew come to Jesus privately and they ask him, tell us when all of this is going to happen. What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled? And so here's when we get into kind of the more apocalyptic perspective here. Jesus replies, don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name claiming I'm the Messiah, and they will deceive many people. And you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Growing up, I heard that phrase all the time. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, and that was being said of the end times that were to come. Jesus, it seems like here, is not speaking about the ultimate end times, but is speaking of that time whenever essentially the temple will fall, and much of Christendom, as well as the disciples themselves, are beginning their season of suffering for their faith and for following Jesus. Whenever this verse 7, was used growing up, you'll hear of wars and threats of wars, or as the King James says, rumors of wars. They never really continued on with the second half of that, where it says, but don't panic. Because I think that these texts were intended to cause us to panic into a relationship with Jesus Christ, to scare us into obedience, to scare us into followership. But this isn't the reason or the motive behind why Jesus gives his disciples this information. So let's keep going. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't immediately follow. And so again, it seems as though Jesus is talking about something that is closer to his time period rather than something that is 2,000 years in the future. Nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. That happened. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world, as well as famines, but this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. And so Jesus obviously is saying here, this is simply just the beginning. When these things begin to happen, though, he tells his disciples who are there listening, watch out. You will be handed over to the local councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. And that happened. Each and every one of the disciples walked a road of suffering. Many of them became martyrs themselves because of their faith and people who were connected to them. But listen to what Jesus says. Jesus says, but this will be your opportunity to tell them about me. So even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of struggle, even in the midst of oppression, this is going to be an open door for you to tell people about me. Maybe with words, maybe just simply with how you respond to suffering and oppression. For the good news must be preached to all nations. Jesus says, keep the mission central, that the good news, the gospel, must be first and foremost in your minds and your hearts and on your lips. But when you are arrested and stand trial, don't worry in advance about what to say. Just say what God tells you at that time, for it is not you who will be speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And so I love this, and then we'll hit pause here because I see that I'm running out of time. I love this, that even whenever you have been arrested and are standing trial, even when you are in a worst case scenario, God is still going to give you words to speak. Don't panic. No matter what may come, God is not only just going to be there with you, beside you, but God's going to give you what to do. He's going to give you what to say. And so what do we get out of this passage? Well, for me, a couple of things come to mind in today's reading. First of all, it seems to be that what Jesus is saying here is that even when the world is spinning out of control, God is still in control. I think that whenever we look at apocalyptic literature, like this short section here in Mark, some of the other Gospels also have some portions of them that are similar. Maybe the most famous apocalyptic literature is the book of Revelation. And so many of us maybe have spent time, and certainly so many other people have spent time trying to dive into these books that talk about apocalypse, that seem to indicate end times, to try to know exactly what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. Why do we want to know those things? Because we're control freaks. We want to be able to control it. Knowing what's going to happen helps us to put it within a box, within boundaries. And once it's in a box and we can handle it, we believe we can control it. I don't think that that's why they're there. I don't think that the reason why Revelation is there and the apocalyptic literature and this section in Mark is given to us so that we can know what's going to happen, so that we can control it, so that we can see it coming. I think that it's there for us to be reminded that the world is going to spin out of control. The world is spinning out of control each and every day, whether it feels like apocalypse or not. But God is in control. Even in the worst of times, God is in control. And so these moments like Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 20 are a reminder that even when bad things happen, it's going to be okay. And this is kind of a different way of saying the same thing, but Jesus seems to be saying here to his immediate disciples who are around him. And I think also he's saying to us who are listening over the shoulder through Mark's lens, don't panic. Things in moments are going to be super bad. Don't panic. There are going to be crazy events, and Jesus gives a series of crazy events, but Jesus also says literally everything is in God's control. Literally everything. There's nothing that's outside of his control. So simply put, do not be anxious. Don't be anxious. And this, I think, is the primary thing that I get out of this passage, and I'm interested in what you see, what you get out of it. So feel free to make those comments today in the chat feed, or whenever you're watching this, feel free to post in here, and I will be interested in your perspective of what you see in this difficult but ultimately very clear passage in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 20. And don't forget, would love to have you be a part of this. You can get in on it. Just go to christtable.today and make sure to get one out to you here in a couple of days when we send the mail out. And for those of you who have already donated, looking forward to having you be a part of the experience, as well as thankful for you being a part of the ministry. But, test feed. Yeah, no, not today. But until tomorrow, happy reading.